Bjorn, it's good to have you.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
So Bjorn, let's go straight to the point. You know what gets you controversial and people don't agree with you always is that you say that the world has made an impossible 169 sustainable development goals.
Yes.
Now, when you say this is basically you're saying it's flawed, it's all messed up, it's overestimated. You are turning around the very principle of what the fight against climate change is supposed to be about. This is the way the world has looked at it for decades now, for years. And you're saying it's not going to work.
Yes.
Why should we believe you?
Well, first of all, on the Sustainable Development Goals, the world had promised these for 2016 to 2030. And they promised everything to everyone. They literally promised that we were going to fix malnutrition and we were going to fix poverty, we were going to fix climate change and corruption and war and jobs and education and everything in between. Look, you can't promise this many different things without not achieving anything. If you promise everything to everyone, you're essentially having no priorities. Some of these solutions are incredibly effective. Some of them are not. And so one of the problems that I run into when we're talking specifically about climate change, which is just a small part of the whole promise that we have for the Sustainable Development Goals, is that people would love to say, let's fix climate change. And yes, it is a problem. But currently, it's going to be fantastically costly to just fix a little bit of it. We're talking, sort of $5.6 trillion per year. This is the McKinsey estimate, but it's pretty much in line with everyone else. The world just can't afford to do that. And so we're not going to do it. Just to give you one example, for India, it would cost about 8.7% of your GDP each and every year to go net zero. You're not going to do that. And so we're fundamentally just making these grand promises. It sounds good and of course gets a lot of applause to the current set of statesmen. But if you actually want to fix problems, you have to focus on smart and effective policies that'll deliver by 2030, and these are not the ones.
Why this and not that? Why wouldn't it be both?
Well, yes.
Okay, so let me put it this way. We have done exceptionally well.
Yes.
We believe we are among the top 10 countries on the Climate Change Performance Index, which means our commitment is tremendous. We've done some great work on renewable power, on energy use efficiency. We believe beyond we are ahead of the game. And you're saying that no, you may think you're ahead of the game, but you have to spend 4 or 5 trillion. I saw the numbers you put out there at the Republic Summit. You got to spend a phenomenal amount of money to actually ensure that these goals are met. Why would you demotivate the government of India, which believes that it's ahead of the game compared to the rest of the world, especially the developed?
It's wonderful that you guys are doing well on climate. And absolutely, I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything about climate. I just say we shouldn't fool ourselves to believe that this is what's going to fix climate change. Remember, India is putting out more and more CO2, although you are putting out more than you possibly otherwise would have done. But you want to industrialize, you want to get rich, you want to get energy, which is exactly what the rich world has done. And so what you will see is you're going to see a tremendous recarbonization of India over the next 20 or 30 years. You're going to do it smarter, and that's great. But that's not how you go to the solutions that we promised in the SDGs, which is essentially going to net zero, because that's going to be very different, that's going to be much costlier, and it's going to be much harder. So by all means,
are you saying we shouldn't bother if the temperatures of the world were to go up, if we were to be full of greenhouse gases, if the world were to collapse? You're saying it's not India's essential focus right now.
So I've got to take exception to the idea of the world is going to collapse. The world is going to have...
You don't think so?
Well, no. And this is also, if you read the UN Climate Panel reports, they tell us global warming is a problem. So if we don't fix global warming right now, it will be more of a problem. The world's only climate economist to win the Nobel Prize, William Nordhaus, estimate that if we do nothing about climate change, by the end of the century, it's going to be equivalent to each one of us being about 4% less well off. In India, because it's going to hit harder, it's going to be about 10%. Now, that's not nothing, but remember, by the end of the century, each Indian is, according to the UN, going to be 11 times richer. So instead of being 11 times richer, you will only feel like you're 10 times richer. This is not the end of the world. it's a problem. And if I can just point out, there are many other problems right now in the world with bad nutrition, with people dying from easily curable infectious diseases, with not enough and not good enough education, and all these other challenges. So global warming is not the only problem. And so what we have to ask ourselves is this where we want to spend trillions of dollars? And mind you, most of the world is not actually doing that. Or do we want to spend billions of dollars, that is, thousands of that, but smartly and effectively and actually address some of the real problems that the world is suffering from right now? If you ask people around the world, and mostly in the global south, what do they care about? They very clearly tell you they care about health, education, jobs, corruption, and nutrition. Those are the top 5 outcomes. When the UN asked them, the very lowest outcome was global warming. Now, I'm not saying that that means we can't do, as you point out, we're a smart species, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. But we need to ask ourselves, is our first priority to spend billions and do incredible good, or is it to spend trillions and make fairly little impact in 100 years? And that's the point I'm trying to make.
So you do believe that there's a little bit of hype about climate change.
I think that would
and
be
you call this in your famous book, false alarm, which I must admit I haven't read yet. But you say how climate change panic costs us trillions, hurts the poor, and fails to fix the planet's fails to fix the planet. Now, essentially, you're saying that all these big meetings which happen, the entire focus on climate change, the fact that even the biggest corporates in the world are putting most of their CSR money all towards climate change, that is the kind of certificate that everyone wants to have, from whether you're using a pencil, whether this is sustainable, that is, everything is linked towards the end goal of proving that you're working towards climate change. You are saying that it skews us in a particular line of thinking. Yeah, that we are in a sort of a dream state where we believe that is the fundamental goal, because what we are being told is that it's going to lead to a cataclysm and everything else can wait. Yes. You're saying this focus is wrong.
That's simply not what the UN Climate Panel is actually telling us. It's the story that we hear from the media all the time, but if you actually look at the indicators, it is not such that the world is hurtling towards the end of its existence. The idea that, as you very rightly point out, the idea that we're being presented is this is the end of the world. And if it is the end of the world, that's the only thing we should be focused on. But in reality, this is, if you'll allow me, a 4% problem. Now, that's not nothing, but there are many other problems.
Why does it consume so much media space then? Why does it consume? There has to be some thinking behind it, some thought behind it, some motivation, or
yes. So that's fundamentally because it's great TV. All these catastrophes, great TV.
Not great business.
Fundamentally, and probably also for public TV. Look, if you look at the last 30 years of U.S., everybody. So the FBI studies all show that crime, let's take away the last couple of years because crime has probably gone up, but crime has basically dropped by half in the US over the last 30 years. Yet if you ask every American, they all think crime has gotten worse. Why? Because you've gotten more and more TV that's constantly showing you here's a crime and here's a crime and here's a crime. It's not the same thing that there's more crime. That's how you need to look at the statistics. So if you look at the same thing, for instance, on how many people die from climate-related disasters, so that's floods, drought, storms, wildfires, and extreme temperatures. If we actually have good data for the last 100 years, it is not such that there are more and more people dying from these climate-related disasters. Even in India, it's dramatically going down. It used to be, for the world, about 500,000 people dying from these catastrophes each and every year in the 1920s. Last decade, in the 2010s, it was 18,000 people, so about 96% less. This is a phenomenal world. Now, remember, this has very little to do with climate. It has everything to do with the fact when you get richer, you're more resilient, you're better able to handle these problems. But what it tells you is when you see the news, when you see the storms, when you see all these things, and you think, oh my God, the world is sort of coming to an end, you're not being told, actually, fewer and fewer people die. If you take the catastrophes, so take the total number.
So why the hype? I mean, you're the first person I'm speaking to who gives the view that we have been made to think and believe that the catastrophe is coming and is going to happen in our lifetimes. Beyond, on a very simplistic level, if you see, whenever we saw these science fiction movies about the end of the world, it was earlier a Martian invasion, then it was an asteroid hitting the world. Now it's always a climate catastrophe. You know, an event which happens so quickly that we have no time to react. So yes, that message is again and again repeated through our media.
Yes. And very
every
much,
form of media. But there must be an interest behind it. The Greta Thunberg doesn't appear from nowhere.
Well, so
there has to be an industry behind this.
So Greta Thunberg, I think, is a great example of this. A lot of people hear this media story, as you just told me, every time over and over. And so Greta Thunberg is basically a very honest teenager, I think, who said, I've looked at all this on TV. They constantly tell me this is the end of the world. Why the hell are we not doing much, much more to do that? I totally get that point. That's absolutely right.
She's saying she's a victim rather than an evangelist.
Well, I think she is certainly a symptom of how we're constantly being told this is the end of the world. But the data does not confirm that. The data tells us that there will be problems with global warming. That's why it's a real problem. But actually right now, so take a new study from The Lancet that came out 2 years ago that tried to look at heat deaths and cold deaths. So heat deaths very clearly will go up as temperature rises. That's a big problem. You hear about it all the time. What you don't hear about is the fact that many more people all across the world die from cold than die from heat. And now as temperatures go up, you would, and not surprisingly, that's also what happens, imagine that there would be fewer cold deaths. Even in
climate change activists must hate you.
Oh God, they hate this because they hate
they must
having
really
this
hate
pointed
you.
out that, look, everything in the real world is about pluses and minuses.
Yes.
Overall, there are going to be more minuses than pluses with global warming. That's why it's a real problem. But only telling you about the negatives and exaggerating the negatives and forgetting the positives doesn't give you a good understanding of the problem. And also, and that's the real issue here, it makes you focus on this as if it was the only challenge we have for the world. And I get it, for rich people whose kids are not going to die from easily curable infectious diseases, who don't suffer from hunger, who go to good schools, yeah, maybe global warming is the sort of remaining thing along with plastic straws and a few other things. And that's good and fine, and I'm happy that there are people worried about that. But we just got to remember that for the vast amount of humanity, and that also includes large parts of India, there are more important issues like getting good schooling, like getting good food, like making sure people don't die from easily curable infectious diseases.
So has India got its priorities right? I feel it does, because I don't think we are fixated on global warming. It's one of the areas.
Yeah.
But we're not fixated on it, because what we are doing in India is raising the aspirations of the people of the country through large investments in infrastructure. We were talking about it beyond the other day. Focus on fundamental health, making health easily accessible. Ensuring that we sort of build our own capabilities in our pharma industry so we don't have overpriced essential drugs which our people are dependent on, improving the quality of education, making education accessible. So I think that what do you think? I mean, we do seem to have, we don't have a sense of misplaced or overplaced priorities on any one area, do we? What's the sense you get? You've been here. And
I've got to say, I don't know well enough about India, and I'm not going to pretend that I know exactly what India is doing well and not so well. But the point is, I think the rest of the world is very clearly focusing, and certainly most of the rich world is clearly focusing almost exclusively on climate change to the detriment of all the other problems. And I think this is an incredible opportunity, really, for India as you host the G20, as you have the presidency, to start saying exactly those points. Modi have pointed out that he wants India to be spokespeople for the global South. And I think there's a real opportunity here to say, look, obviously climate change is a problem. Yes. We should also focus on it. But please, let's also remember all the other stuff that matters.
Yes, but Dr. Lomborg, you say that we will end up missing achieving our promises of eradicating hunger by a huge margin, despite being at the half-time of having made that promise already.
Yes.
So you say it's time for a green revolution.
I'm saying
we've already been through one green revolution in India, and I personally believe our green revolution was a case of misplaced priorities, where we replaced our existing food grains with wheat. We did mass consumption, And now what we are doing is a return to basics with the focus on millets. My question to you, therefore, is that given how studies suggest that 1/3 of all global food production is wasted, don't you think we need to produce more efficient distribution systems, focus on the basics, rather than trying to bring a Western import of agriculture into countries like India?
So I'm going to be a little controversial, maybe disagree with you. So we've looked at this for Andhra Pradesh and for Rajasthan.
What have you
We've looked at, is it a good idea to try to reduce the amount of spillage in production?
Yes.
And absolutely, you're absolutely right. A quarter to a third of all production is lost out in the field and in the production chain. And that sounds like a terrible waste and something that you could really easily do something about.
Yes.
Well, the reason why it keeps happening is because it's not easy to do. And so I'm an economist. So actually, I'm a pretend economist. I work with a lot of the world's best economists. I'm just a political scientist.
That's what they attack you.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
What
we're trying to say is there are really effective ways to improve food production, and there are not as effective ways. It turns out that if you want a full, much better production line, you need much better incentives, especially in agriculture. You need to make sure that people don't leave food out on the field. You need to have much better storage chains, which has huge problems and is very costly. It needs a lot of infrastructure. So what we found was you can do this. And you can probably do it to the extent that for every rupee you spend, you will do 2 or 3 rupees of good. That's a good investment, mind you. So absolutely, that would be good to do. But what we try to point out is, if you focus on agricultural research and development, that is essentially have Indian researchers look for Indian solutions for India, and that could be very well millets, or that's a political conversation of what exactly do you want to focus on. But have Indian researchers come up with better seeds that produce more for every hectare. That is an incredibly much more effective way to make sure that you get more food. It will feel wrong because what you're doing is you're simply producing more out there. You're still leaving a quarter of it out there, but that means more food gets in to the consumer in the cities much more effectively. So actually, for every rupee you spend on this policy, you will do 33 rupees of social good. I'm simply pointing out 33 is much, much better than 3, and that's why we should start with that amazing policy.
So we go back to the whole issue, and I'm intrigued with this. Critics say that you, especially you particularly, they say that you cherry pick data. You say that there is highly skewed data. I'm very taken with this whole idea of climate change being an alarmist idea. And, you say there's highly skewed data. To take the alarmist approach about a rise in global temperature and link everything to that. On the other side says that you are cherry picking the data. I'm trying to understand here a bigger issue. You talk about the global south. Is the entire global south, as it were, following a Western agenda on climate change, which is going to make us compromise on what our own priorities should be like? I don't know who to believe. I mean, should we believe Bjorn Lomborg, who takes this view, or should we believe the Greta Thunberg lobby?
Yes. Well, I don't think you should believe Greta Thunberg. I mean, after all, she's a teenager. You probably shouldn't believe me because I'm not a climate scientist. You should believe the UN climate panel, and you should believe the world's chief climate economist. So let me just give you a very simple point here. This is not about saying that global warming is not a real issue. It is about saying how much of an issue is it and how much will it cost to fix it. And unlike
but these are fantastical numbers.
It is.
Let me tell you this.
Yes.
In August 2020, it was written about you. Dr. Lomborg's arguments are based on fantastical numbers that have little or no credibility. This was, I think, an analysis of your book. Overall, the numbers presented by Dr. Lomborg, who has a PhD in political science, they emphasize the fact, understate the potential economic impacts of climate change and exaggerate the costs of cutting greenhouse gases. So they say you're trying to make it look very expensive, underplay the economic impact of it. They said you're not understanding the economic impact on it.
Yes.
And they say that, you are the poster boy of right-wing newspapers.
Yes.
You are the poster boy of the Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, and that you're putting the world in a direction which it's going to pay heavily for. Dr. Lomborg, you're a controversial man behind that pleasant demeanor.
And this is some of the nicest stuff.
This is the nicest stuff written about
that you're actually quoting. This is a very emotional area, and so absolutely.
Please expand on it.
Yes. So absolutely. If I was just trying to say, oh, it's going to be fantastically costly and actually global warming, downplaying it and all that stuff, but I'm not. I am not making this argument. It's the world's only climate economist to get the Nobel Prize in Climate Economics who is making that point. They have gone rapid on him as well and telling, oh, you can't trust him. It's much worse than he says, and it's going to be much, much cheaper than he claims. And that most climate economists tells you. So the point here is to remember, global warming consists of a lot of different conversations. It consists on the conversation of what's going to happen physically. That's what the UN Climate Panel is really good at. So sea levels are going to rise. What will that have of an impact? Now, a lot of people and a lot of natural scientists will tell you first order is simply, well, if you look at the sea level rise about a meter, that means, there's 187 million people living within a meter of sea level rise. That means 187 million people have to move. That was actually a headline in the New York Times and Washington Post and many other papers. But of course, that's not what happens over the next 80 years. Most, and especially rich countries, and India will be rich by then, they build dikes. We know how to do that. That's what Holland has done. And so if you take any realistic assumption into that, it turns out, and those people who made the 187 million figure actually point out, that's a totally unrealistic number. That's a number assuming nobody does anything. If we assume reasonable adaptation, it will be in the order of 15,000 people. That is a tremendously much smaller number. And that's why you hear one of these scare stories. The other part, of course, is what's the economics of this? How much will it cost if we don't do anything? But also, how much will it cost if we do something? There are costs to both of these. And the guy who wrote that, he's a particular nemesis. And we should also just point out, he's not a climate economist. He didn't even get his PhD in geophysics. But hey, but whatever. He points out that it's incredibly cheap to do climate policy. Well, I think if we look around the world, that has been thoroughly disproven. It is incredibly expensive in most places, and we keep spending more and more trillions on trying to prove how cheap it is. On the other hand, he also tells us it is going to be incredibly damaging. But if you look at the current estimates, so we have good data from 1990 to 2022, how much is all the climate-related damage for the world? It's actually slightly trending downwards in percent of GDP, not upwards. And that's because whatever climate damage is out there is vastly overwhelmed by the fact that as the world gets richer and smarter, we simply get more resilient and better at handling. Now, this does not, again, mean that there's no problem, but it means that this scare stories that we constantly hear that only goes one way, it only ever tells you that here's a fire. And it's not surprising. I mean, if you think about Republic TV, you will go out when there's a fire. I'm reporting here from a fire. You will never be, I'm reporting here from no fire. Did you know that over the last 22 years, so from 1900 till today, the world is burning less and less, although you hear more and more about it. It's a well-known fact. Science and nature have written about it because we have satellites that circle the planet all the time for the last 25 years. The amount of area that is burning in the world has gone down dramatically. Again, this has very little to do with climate. It has everything to do with the fact that when there's people, they want to protect their fields, they want to protect their houses, and so they make preventive measures to have less burning. So when you hear about these stories that there's more and more burning, it's true some places, and some of the places are because we've had bad forest management for 20 years, 100 years. But fundamentally, the world is actually not burning more and more, although that's what you hear. The world is very, very clearly burning less and less. And this is not even controversial, except for when I say it, because it doesn't deliver the right message.
सिद्धार्थ 8 तारीख को हार्ड ड्राइव से डेटा डिलीट हुआ था। रिपब्लिक पूछ रहा आपसे। सिद्धार्थ मैं पूछ रहा हूँ 8 तारीख को हार्ड ड्राइव से डेटा डिलीट हुआ था। डेटा डिलीट हुआ था हार्ड ड्राइव से, आपने बताया क्या था डेटा? 8 हार्ड ड्राइव का डेटा डिलीट हुआ था या नहीं?
He has been cooperating with the summons. Why have you arrested him in such a fashion? He has been interrogated for over 100 hours, sir.
First to get out of this.
If you don't
First to get out of this. First to get out of this. Get out of this. First to get out of this. First to get out of this. First to get out of this.
He has cooperated.
Get out of this.
He has cooperated.
Get out of this.
He
Get out
has
of
been
this.
cooperating, sir.
Get out of
I am
this.
merely asking you. He has been cooperating.
Get out
I'm
of
sorry. We are also cooperating. We are also cooperating.
Yeah, please cooperate.
Both men, women, they are marching towards the road. Though some clashes are also witnessed here at the Sheikhpura road. See the tear smoke shells being used by the Jammu and Kashmir police. Now we can see also that the protesters are not crossing the line.
सिद्धार्थ 8 तारीख को हार्ड ड्राइव से डेटा डिलीट हुआ था। रिपब्लिक पूछ रहा है आपसे। सिद्धार्थ मैं पूछ रहा हूँ 8 तारीख को हार्ड ड्राइव से डेटा डिलीट हुआ था। डेटा डिलीट हुआ था हार्ड ड्राइव से, आपने बताया है? क्या था डेटा? 8 हार्ड ड्राइव का डेटा डिलीट हुआ था या नहीं?
यहाँ पर लिखा गया है स्टैंड। इसी जगह से सचिन वाजे को बोला गया था खड़े रहने के लिए।
That is Christian Michelle. First visuals on your scene. Christian, would you want to speak? Christian, have you turned down the Gruak? Christian, would you give facts to India? सिद्धार्थ 8 तारीख को हार्ड ड्राइव से डेटा डिलीट हुआ था। रिपब्लिक पूछ रहा है आपसे। सिद्धार्थ मैं पूछ रहा हूँ 8 तारीख को हार्ड ड्राइव से डेटा डिलीट हुआ था। डेटा डिलीट हुआ था हार्ड ड्राइव से, आपने बताया है? क्या था डेटा? 8 हार्ड ड्राइव का डेटा डिलीट हुआ था या नहीं? सिद्धार्थ 8 तारीख को हार्ड ड्राइव से डेटा डिलीट हुआ था। रिपब्लिक पूछ रहा है आपसे। सिद्धार्थ मैं पूछ रहा हूँ 8 तारीख को हार्ड ड्राइव से डेटा डिलीट हुआ था।
You know, I've always believed behind these sort of human rights activists, there's a corporate agenda. This is one of my views, Bjorn, that these people don't work from a pure altruistic place. They work. They have agendas. They have their motivations, and then they disguise them in many ways. If I go deeper, I don't believe that everything that started with that Al Gore film till now is accidental or driven by the need to change the world. Very often, you know, humanitarian agendas are at the forefront of, for example, global wars. You know, we say we want to change the world, we want to change the Middle East, but what we really are after is the oil. Similarly, the same lobbies that push those humanitarian quote-unquote agendas are also pushing the same ecological and environmental agendas. They're one set. So what are they going after here? Because when I'm hearing you, I'm only thinking, okay, so it's easy to call Bjorn Lomborg a child of you know, the right-wing media, and to sort of paint him into a corner. That's what they do. But I'm also thinking from my country's perspective, that are we getting caught in a limbo? We are the voice of the global South.
Exactly.
Maybe we should be talking about whether there is unfair pressure on the global South, and you know, are we picking up someone else's garbage? To put it very, very simply. So, two questions to you. One, you must have thought about this deeply. Are there other agendas, business agendas, corporate agendas behind this? You know, Bjorn, let me take it away to you. I'll just give a longer example of this. Once there was a huge sort of a protest outside a nuclear power plant in South India, a Kodankolam power plant. And it was called an environmental agenda. We'd done an investigation on it on Republic, and when we found out it's because the country where the reactor came from was diametrically a competitor to the country that was trying to sell the reactor.
Right.
So the environmental agenda just played somewhere in between. So again, two questions to you. One, agenda, and you can expand on this as much as you want. Second, are we being caught in a limbo? India as well as the global South.
So on the first one, I tend to be a little more forgiving and maybe just naive. I've met with a lot of these guys, Al Gore and many others. My sense is that they're really driven by fundamentally wanting to do good. I'm glad that we have an Al Gore. What I don't like is that we only listen to Al Gore and that we don't have an Al Gore for poverty and we don't have an Al Gore for bad education or for bad nutrition and all the other global problems. He sort of gets all the attention because there's none others. With that said, of course there is a corporate agenda behind it. There's a corporate agenda for pretty much everything. So, back in 2009, when we had the Global Climate Summit in Copenhagen, back when in 2009 we were going to solve the whole issue, Vestas, which is a Danish wind turbine company, they had on all metro stations, they had, please make a strong climate deal. Which of course is also in their own interest, right? I mean, that they know that means we're going to buy a lot of their stuff. Look, there's nothing wrong with that. Wind turbine companies will try to sell wind turbines. That's fine. Yes. So again, I think it's not very helpful to try and talk about, oh, we're being misled by this, that, and the other. We need to take the responsibility to say we're not just going to listen to Al Gore and Greta Thunberg. We're also going to listen to what the UN Climate Panel, the only climate economist to win the Nobel Prize, and many others, including hopefully me, to talk about what should we do. That goes to the second question that you talked about, which is, are we caught in a limbo? Is India essentially sort of taking over an agenda from the rest of the world and from the rich world? I don't know the answer to that, but I hope that you won't. Because in reality, you should, exactly as you pointed out, speak for the global South and say, what is it they want? When the UN asked 10 million people across the world, what do you want our priorities to be? As I started out the program with, they want to focus on health, education, jobs, corruption, and nutrition. Those are the top 5 things. They put climate at the very bottom. Now, of course, if you scare people sufficiently, you can get it sort of further up, but it doesn't mean it's the top priority. And India, in some ways, should say, we want to be the defenders of these things that actually matter for the global South. I would think that would be really a good move for India. But of course, and that we then come back to saying what we just talked about with the getting efficient agriculture versus, for instance, making the losses in the agricultural sector smaller. When you then start talking about, so what should we do about all these problems? There are, again, good and less efficient solutions. And that's what I actually work on. So I work on climate, but much of my work is also to say, okay, once we start being slightly as panicked on climate change and start opening up to talking about all these other issues, here are some of the very best things we could do for the world if we actually want to focus not trillions, but billions to do good.
Well, I find it also, I mean, I've always felt here that the West has an agenda to sort of control the rest of the world. And after this sort of demise of globalization, if I may say so, I'm not being, after the sort of the waning of globalization, maybe climate change is one of those agendas that they want to envelope the rest of the world in and get them into some kind of a binding agreement. But I'm also very concerned because at the end of the day, there is always limited money. And as you rightly say, it's a question of where you spend your money. And for a country with the opportunities, resources, but also challenges of India, I think you're very right. We should be focused towards solving our long-standing issues, fighting and ending poverty, which we are doing very well. We are making our country very aspirational, deepening infrastructure, but these are areas which require tremendous amounts of investment.
Yes.
Now, I therefore find it interesting that, in the World Economic Forum report, which said that the 2030 agenda for sustainable development was said to be missed. The report also said, and I have a quote here, that Sustainable Development Goals Report 2022 paints a worrying picture of progress in almost all areas. The report quotes an inflation factor of 25% required to now meet these goals. Yeah. So it's like interest levels going up. You're never going to meet the goals, and you're going to make an incredible amount of expenditure, which could be spent on different sectors of the population here.
Let me just give you one example of this. So there's.
But
a
I'm
lot
also asking, is the Paris Agreement unsustainable then?
Yes,
Is it unsustainable?
They're very unsustainable because they ask countries to do stuff that when the push comes to shove, they're never going to do. Just to give you an example, a study shows that it's going to cost.
So should we rescind from that agreement?
Well, the
I'm
point
just
here is
very-
we need to find a smarter way to solve global warming. The reason why we can't solve global warming very well is because everybody's running around like their hair is on fire and saying, we got to do something next year. If you're going to do something next year, the only solutions are expensive. If you want to solve the problem, you need to do it through technological innovation. Take, for instance, Craig Venter, the guy who cracked the human genome back in 2000. He has this idea that you could develop algae that you can grow on the ocean surface. They'll soak up sunlight and CO2 and produce oil. Then you just simply harvest that out on the ocean surface. You have your own Saudi Arabias out there. You harvest it, you put it in your existing fossil fuel infrastructure, but it's now CO2 neutral because it's just been grown out on the ocean surface. This is a fantastic innovation if it could work. It doesn't right now. It's vastly inefficient, right? So it's not going to work. But that's one of the many, many ways in which if we could innovate, find a way to have green energy cheaper than fossil fuels, everyone, not just rich, well-meaning Westerners, but also India, China, Africa, would just simply buy this. And so the point here is, and that's what we've been trying to do for a very long time, we work with more than 50 of the world's top climate economists, 3 Nobel laureates, to try to identify where can you spend resources on climate and do the most good. And what they found was the best long-term investment is in energy innovation. Nobody spends on that. We've actually spent less and less on that because everybody is again running around and saying, we got to do it next year. We're not going to do this. The world is not going to spend this amount of money. So, for Biden, it's going to cost somewhere between $5,000 and $11,000 per person per year in 2050. There's no way people and politicians are going to be reelected on that sort of promise. People are just going to fire them. And imagine spending 8.7%, and this is in a best case scenario, of India's GDP every year on going
So what would you tell the government?
You should say.
What would you tell the government? What would you tell our government right now, central government? Since you seem to say that the fundamentals behind climate activism are very short-sighted. Yes. Since you are clearly saying that the Paris Agreement is unsustainable, since you are saying, and it was your word, that the Paris Agreement is the most expensive pact in human history. Yeah. And it's and since you're already a hated figure among those lobbies, let's go all the way. What will you say to the government of India would be an alternative view that we can take without being unpopular? Because you see, India is also, on climate change, seen to be one of the leading lights in the world. And we have admirably achieved our targets. So we would have the weight to carry with us if we were to change the direction a bit.
Yes.
India would probably be the country that would have the most influence, I guess.
Yeah, and look, India could help both fix climate change and fix all the other problems in the world. So one is to say, instead of making these trillion-dollar promises that nobody's going to do in climate, let's make billion-dollar promises on investing in green energy, research and development. Fundamentally, you're only going to solve this if you get the technology that'll make it cheaper to solve it. If solar and wind was cheaper than fossil fuels, it is technically right now, but not when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing. But
you said it's economically unsustainable.
It's unsustainable right now, which of course is why the rich countries have to pay so much in order to do a little bit of feel-good policy. So that's the way to fix climate. But opening up that space, so saying instead of us spending trillions of dollars, right now the world is spending $1.1 trillion, but everybody's saying we need to go up to $5 or $6 trillion, which is just unaffordable in any climate, but certainly in this one especially. If we can now go down to, say, spend $100 billion, so a tenth of that, but on smart climate innovation, that means we will have a lot of room for remembering all the other problems in the world. So India has to thread that needle. And that's going to be hard to say, look, we care about climate, we care about the stuff that you worry a lot about in the rich world, but we care enough about it to want to do it smartly and in a way that's actually sustainable and one that you can also get your own voters to say yes to in the long run. And happily that means we can then also start worrying about all the other challenges. The fact that there are still 1.4 million people dying from tuberculosis. It's not COVID that kills the most people. Now, in 2022, it's again tuberculosis. The fact that almost 500 million kids in the global south are in school but not learning. The fact that we have too much malnutrition, that we don't have enough dealing with, for instance, chronic disease. There's lots and lots of people, especially in the global south, that die from chronic disease like increased heart pressure, that we know how to fix very, very cheaply. So what we're trying to say is, if we stop having this very, very uniform only climate change conversation, but start saying, let's do this smartly, but also recognize it's just one of many problems, that opens up the conversation to all the other issues.
But that can't be the case, because if that were to be the case, if it was not to be an alarm over COVID, then how would the pharma companies make money? And you've seen those, I don't know if you saw that interview where there was a chase by, I think it was an Australian digital news site, which ran behind, I think it was the president or CEO of Moderna, asking him about whether they were experimenting at the cost of human lives. And there was a hype over COVID. And at the Republic Summit itself, the Prime Minister said that there was a lot of pushback on our Prime Minister when he went in for an indigenous vaccine. So I don't know, but I do believe there are very many global corporate interests involved in this.
You're absolutely right. And this is where my naivete, I think, helps me a little bit, because I'm not trying to say...
Are you naive, or are you trying to underplay that? I think
yes,
you're trying to underplay.
I can't say I'm naive, because then
You're not naive at all.
But look, my point is not to say that I would love the whole world to be totally rational and smart and do all the right things. But I'm going to just say, how about we do it a little less wrong? How about we move it from being incredibly wrong to slightly less wrong? That would be an amazing achievement. That's what India's G20 ambition should be, right? Imagine if we can make the world slightly less alarmist on climate change, slightly more smart on climate change, and open up slightly more the conversation to all these other challenges. The amazing thing, and I just want to point that out, because that's what my new book is all about, right? It's about talking about the amazing things that the world could do if we focused on the smartest solutions in the world. So if we focused on things like better education, as we talked about, on tuberculosis, on malaria, on chronic diseases, and maternal and newborn health, and all these other things. We have 12 different things. If we spent money there, and we're not talking trillions, we're talking $35 billion. In most connections, that's almost couch change in the global economy, right? $35 billion, you know what that could do? It could save 4.2 million lives each and every year. That's about 10% of global death in the global south. That's amazing. And it would make the global south $1.1 trillion richer each and every year. This would be one of the most fantastic things we can do. We don't focus on that because everybody's running around and talking about climate change. If we talk a little smarter about climate change, fix that through innovation, which is much cheaper, but it's not going to fix it next year, then we can also open up to talking about all these other issues.
So the entire climate change debate so far is very centered on one perspective, isn't it? We have an opportunity here. I mean, this coming September, there's an SDG Summit in the UN headquarters in New York. In the last high-level political forum on SDGs, which happened last year, the agenda was accelerated progress towards sustainable development goals. So they're not giving up.
Oh, God.
They're saying we need to spend more, we need to do more, we've messed up. Okay, India is doing better, but by that definition, it would imply the least worst.
Yes.
Right? But they're saying we need to recommit ourselves to those goals, so they're not letting go here.
So Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has just come out and said we need a 500 billion pact on pushing the SDGs.
Who's going to pay for it?
I know, exactly. That's the point. Nobody's going to be able to pay for it.
And in a time of global recession, who's going to pay for it all the more?
And again, let's just remember, that's about 1/20th of what is actually needed. So he's basically saying, look, can we raise a totally incredible and impossible amount, which is actually not going to cover very much of it, but let's try to throw in some more money in
It's a scam, isn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, is it becoming
I don't think it's a scam. I think these people literally think the best world that we could possibly imagine is we do all the stuff we promised. We fix hunger, we fix poverty, we fix global warming, we fix corruption. Oh, and we also get organic apples to everyone and all the other things that are in these 169 promises. And that's going to cost somewhere between 10 and 15 trillion dollars extra per year. Now, nobody's going to come up with that, but they're simply thinking, get more money is better. And I get that point. But a much better approach is to say, why don't we start with the smartest stuff first? Instead of promising everything to everyone, why don't we do the really smart policies? So that's what we're saying, for instance, in education. In education right now, we have about 500 million kids in primary school all across the global south. They're not learning anything. So they're literally, many of them have virtually no clue what's going on. One simple way, and India has actually been leading the world in this, is to have what's called learning at the right level. So if you're in 6th grade, but you actually only know 3rd grade level, you're stuck. You have no idea what's going on, and your teacher's just far ahead of you. If you put this kid in front of, say, a tablet 1 hour a day, tablet with educational software that will very quickly figure, oh, you're at 3rd grade level. I'm going to teach you at 3rd and a half grade level, start getting you a little bit ahead for about $30 per pupil per year. We're not giving away the tablet to this kid. We're just using it 1 hour a day. That kid can learn 3 years of schooling in 1 year. That'll generate so much extra income when he or she becomes adult and becomes more productive in adult lives. It's basically going to deliver 65 rupees for every rupee spent.
I heard
That's
you
a
say
fantastic investment. And so we have lots of those things. Why don't we do that first?
Well, I think because we've been brainwashed, perhaps. How easy is it to be a contrarian? How easy is it for you personally? I wanted to be a contrarian in an area of climate change, and I'm just trying to think of how easy it would be for anybody to be a contrarian in any other part without being typecast. You see, from both a philosophical and a real perspective, the moment you have a contrary view, you are put into brackets and buckets.
Yeah.
How easy is it for you, Bjorn, to be a contrarian? How easy has it been? Do you give up sometimes?
So I'm going to tell you, I'm going to make two answers to that. One is, I feel that it would be much, much nicer if people just said, oh, that's a really good idea. I mean, I'm coming with something, and again, it's not me. I'm working with some of the world's top economists who've actually come out with these amazing ideas on how to do better education. I would love people to just say, yeah, we should do that. And yes, it's a little annoying that people say, but Bjorn said it. So in that sense, of course it's annoying. On the other hand, so very early on when I started this whole conversation, I got into this I'm an old Greenpeace kind of guy. I was not out in a rubber boat.
Oh, I didn't see that.
but I was, I had the badge and the backpack and the poster on my wall, and I worried a lot about the world. And so I read up on this, and I realized that a lot of what I'd been told was not correct. And that's really how this whole thing started. So a lot of people got really, really angry at me. And one of the things that I was told was they have a saying at Harvard Law School, which is, if you have a good case, you pound the case. If you have a bad case, you pound the table. And most people who criticize me are basically just pounding the table. And I've always felt like, I thought this was exciting when we first did this academically. And I was like, yes, show me how I'm wrong. Show me the data set that shows that this. But people were just pounding on the table. Most people are just really, really annoyed that I make these points. But in some sense, that makes me feel like, somebody needs to make these points, because we need to know if we're over worried about one thing, climate, and under worried about all these other things that also matter. And so in some sense, I think I would love for everyone to just say, oh, that's great ideas. But the next best thing certainly is to say, the current approach is spectacularly failing. Let's do better.
I personally, I'll wrap up with this, Bjorn, don't believe in this left and right wing division around the world. I think it's very, very convenient. I think it's important to have contrarian views in every area, from climate change to geopolitics, and also in the way societies relate to each other nowadays. And I think that's the beauty of having a diverse intellectual discourse. Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, to make your acquaintance, and I hope that you will keep coming back to India, and we'll have a chance to take these conversations forward. Thank you, Bjorn.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bjorn. Thank you. Thank you.
यहाँ पर लिखा गया है स्टैंड। इसी जगह से सचिन वाजे को बोला गया था खड़े रहने के लिए।
सिद्धार्थ 8 तारीख को हार्ड ड्राइव से डेटा डिलीट हुआ था। रिपब्लिक पूछ रहा आपसे। सिद्धार्थ मैं पूछ रहा हूँ 8 तारीख को हार्ड ड्राइव से डेटा डिलीट हुआ था। डेटा डिलीट हुआ था हार्ड ड्राइव से, आपने बताया क्या था डेटा? 8 हार्ड ड्राइव का डेटा डिलीट हुआ था या नहीं?
That is Christian Michel. First visuals on your scene. Christian, would you want to speak? Christian, have you turned in a brewer? Christian, would you give facts to India?
सिद्धार्थ 8 तारीख को हार्ड ड्राइव से डेटा डिलीट हुआ था। रिपब्लिक पूछ रहा आपसे। सिद्धार्थ मैं पूछ रहा हूँ 8 तारीख को हार्ड ड्राइव से डेटा डिलीट